All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of informative sessions on state and local tax policy sponsored by the LWVNC Tax Policy Review Committee. Can we go to next slide, Elaine, please? Members of the committee include myself, Martha Robley, acting as co-chair with Ruth Ann Groh, who's also a member of the Orange Durham Chatham Local League, also known as ODC. I am also the unit coordinator for the Mid Sandhills MAL unit based in Scotland County. Lucille Howard, who was a key contributor to the last study done in the late 80s, is a member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg League, and Elaine Okel is a member of the Wake County League, and fortunately is our Zoom techie. Thank you, Elaine. I will now turn it over to Elaine for her to review the Zoom webinar basics with our attendees.
Whoops. Okay, sorry. So you will see some Zoom, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Zoom, you will see some controls at the bottom of your screen where you can chat, raise hand, or Q&A, or leave the meeting. These are for if you are on a laptop. You will be muted when you come on, and you will remain muted throughout the meeting unless we unmute you. Please do not use the chat feature. Use the Q&A feature to ask any questions. You can ask questions during the meeting, and then we will take those, and if we have time, ask our presenter those questions. When the meeting is over, you can press leave the meeting. If anyone is on a mobile phone, these are the controls that you will see. There's a start video at the bottom. There's join audio and see the participants. When you want to leave, press the leave button. Again, you have using the three dots in the right-hand corner of your phone, you can chat and raise your hand. Please, again, don't use your chat. And then as Zoom, as attendees, you won't be able to start your video feed unless we allow you to. Share your screen, rename yourself, unmute your microphone unless we allow that, or send a chat to everyone. Please do not record or stream this meeting. It is being recorded, and we will share on the LWVNC website at another time. Also, please do not share the meeting link.
Thank you, Elaine. We go back to my first slide, please. There we go. Thank you very much. As I stated earlier, tonight's session is the first in a series of informative sessions focusing on specific aspects of state and local taxation. This will include things like criteria for a fair and equitable tax system. Does our current state policy of lower corporate taxes further the goals and economic growth of the state for its residents? And we will also take a look at other state league tax policy positions and their effectiveness to further that state league's advocacy goals. Our ultimate goal at the end of these sessions is to work towards member agreement on a revised LWVNC state and local tax policy, and that will be the subject of our last session. With that background, let me outline tonight's format. First, we will have our guest speaker's presentation. That's Alexandra Forder Sirota. She's the Executive Director for the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. Following Alexandra's presentation, either Lucille or I will pose follow-up questions from the committee to her. And as time permits, It will end with me moderating questions from the attendees. And again, as Elaine instructed, we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A room by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, not to use the chat. Next slide, please. We are very pleased to have Alexandra Sirota as our guest presenter for our first session. Alexandra is the Executive Director of the NC Budget and Tax Center. Excuse me. I'm sorry, we had an echo. As I said, Alexandra is the Executive Director of the NC Budget and Tax Center, where she oversees strategic direction of the organization. Alexandra joined the NC Budget and Tax Center while it was a project of the NC Justice Center in April 2010. She has coordinated numerous research initiatives and policy campaigns at the state level. Among them was a progressive response to the significant legislative overhaul of the tax code of 2013 and ongoing tax law changes since that time. Alexandra has a broad range of experience at nonprofits and government agencies, both in the US and abroad, including starting her career in Central America, where she worked in El Salvador with a rural health organization and in Costa Rica with a Human Rights Research Institute. She received a bachelor's degree from Haverford College in Pennsylvania and a joint master's degree from the University of Chicago. Alexandra, I'll now turn it over to you, and thank you.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to be with you all tonight to talk about taxes, my favorite topic, because it really is about our dollars and our future. So I'll jump right in to say that at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, where I serve as executive director, we analyze and partner to understand the impacts. Am I sharing the right screen? Sorry.
Yep.
Can you see my screen?
Not now.
Oh, can you see it
There
now?
you go.
Okay,
That's
great. Where we analyze and partner to understand the impacts of budget and tax decisions on the quality of life for all North Carolinians, Black, brown, and white, from Wilson to Waynesville. Since 2010, I've analyzed tax policy in North Carolina with the goal of making clear how tax choices impact our state's future and our collective well-being today. I'm excited to be here with the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. Your organization has consistently lifted up the connections that tax policy has to funding for public schools, to free and fair elections, and so much more. We're grateful for your work in this area and your partnership. The North Carolina Budget and Tax Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We have a vision that North Carolina can be a place where every person can reach their full potential and achieve greater well-being through the support of trustworthy anti-racist institutions and systems that we all participate in building. We see the path to that vision depends on tax decisions. Taxes are our collective wealth. They are the way in which we pay for things as a community that no individual person on their own can pay for. And so who pays taxes, how taxes are distributed, and what do taxes pay for are directly connected to our individual and collective economic prosperity. You all have been thinking a lot about tax policy, but the fundamental purpose of a tax code that sometimes can get obscured in all of the detail of the design and discussion about decision points is that at base, the purpose of a tax code is to fund public goods that can ensure benefits across our state and can be sustainable over time. So from the water that we drink, to the roads we drive on, to the healthcare that we can access, to the education that we're connected to, tax codes are really the foundation and the framework that sets out opportunities in our communities and economy. And they can also be a barrier to opportunity in our communities. So I'm here today to give you a little bit of context about where we are in North Carolina in terms of our state tax code and what impacts tax decisions have had on our economy, on our communities, and on people. North Carolina policymakers for many years have long debated how to fix the state's tax code on both sides of the aisle, recognizing that there were issues with the way our tax code was keeping up with the needs in communities. Beginning in 2012, legislative leaders, emboldened by a majority and with new control of the governor's mansion, pushed forward an overhaul of the tax code in our state. It was informed not by those various commissions and task forces that had been formed previously. It wasn't even informed by the full body of legislators. It was very much motivated by outside interests, like Grover Norquist, pictured here in a press briefing on the tax proposal, and Arthur Laffer, many of you who may be familiar with his Laffer curve theory, made famous during the Reagan era. In December 2012, a report from Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore, published by the North Carolina Civitas organization, proposed complete elimination of the income tax in North Carolina. And this set the foundation and the ultimate goal for tax decisions in North Carolina over the past decade. It continues to guide legislative leaders year after year. But the reality in 2013 was that moving to complete elimination of the income tax was too swift and too politically difficult to move forward. There were a couple of reasons for that. One, sales tax rates would have had to double to make up for the lost revenue of complete elimination of the personal income tax. Many very popular deductions and exemptions would have had to been eliminated. And the loss of federal funds in combination with the loss of the income tax cut would mean that state revenue losses would lead to dramatic spending cuts that would reduce class time for students, eliminate core healthcare services for older North Carolinians. And so what happened in 2013 was the beginning of an ongoing effort to get to zero income tax. And it began primarily with adopting a lower flat personal income tax rate, expanding the base of sales tax to more services, eliminating refundable tax credits and exemptions, eliminating the estate tax, and capping itemized deductions for things like mortgage interest, property taxes, and charitable contributions. Since that time, legislators have continued the pursuit of zero income tax. And what this graph really shows you is how since 2013, each year, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2021, and again in 2023, we saw proposals to continue to reduce the rate on personal income tax, personal income in the state from the low rate to where we are today. The same is true on the corporate income tax side, with the scheduled complete elimination of the corporate income tax by 2030. But it hasn't just been lowering of rates. I just want to say that over this time, in addition, legislative leaders have also raised the standard deduction. So the level at which a household can exempt portions of their income from that tax rate. So changing the base of income that the tax rate is applied to. They've raised the cap on itemized deductions, and they've also phased down the franchise tax, which is another tax paid by business entities. So where do all these ideas come from? I talked at the beginning about the early days and outside influence, but these ideas continue to be powered primarily by outside interests. Tax Foundation has consistently lifted up North Carolina as a model for tax changes across the country and has actively engaged with the legislature to pursue tax changes in our state. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has lifted up the proponents of tax plans through various awards and chair leadership positions in their organization, and continue to lift up North Carolina as a model. And the North Carolina Chamber has also been engaged in actively supporting these ideas over the past decade. But I think it's important to say that most liberals, moderates, and conservatives agree on a lot that the tax policies are bad economic policies. This is particularly around polling around the corporate income tax. And you can see that most North Carolinians across these ideological spectrums find the elimination of the corporate income tax would be ineffective to help our economy. Importantly, too, we know that in the past year, the North Carolina Chamber has begun to state publicly that while they want competitive tax rates, they've never proposed going to zero. And they think it's important to have a discussion about what we give up when we go to zero income tax. This statement was in the context of considering the funding of childcare, which is an essential foundation to a strong economy. So as the conversation about North Carolina's tax code has progressed over the past decade, we've heard three core common arguments for these changes. One, that these would make North Carolina more competitive with other states. Two, that they would create more jobs. And three, that they would put more money in people's pockets. So I want to talk a little bit about these changes and what we find in our analysis. And the analysis that we've done shows there's a strong case against these arguments. Lowering income rates on corporate profits and personal income are not likely to deliver a more competitive environment for people or businesses. Tax rates aren't how states generally compete for people and business. Job creation in North Carolina over the past decade has not outperformed our neighbors, which is something that we should see in the data if the promise was to come true. And when we look annually at who receives the greatest share of tax cuts, it really has been the very richest North Carolinians, not everyday North Carolinians. So I'll dig a little bit deeper on the data for this, and I think you'll get the slides and be able to see some of the references as well. When the tax changes were proposed in North Carolina, our tax rates were in the middle of the pack across the country. We really weren't a high tax state. We weren't a low tax state. We were sort of right in the middle. And right now, our rates are among the lowest in the country. North Carolina has the lowest corporate income tax rate in the country for states that have a corporate income tax. One of the things, again, like I said, was an argument that was made is that we needed to be more competitive with other states to attract people and businesses. But what we know is that before the tax cuts went into effect, when North Carolina's tax rates were at their highest point, we had the second highest domestic migration in the country during the decade from 2000 to 2010. And that makes sense. People were moving here for different reasons. We know most people move from state to state for family or job purposes. They move for climate reasons, and they move for the amenities. Some of that, again, can be diminished when we underinvest in the natural resources, in the universities, and in the schools in our communities. I think importantly, overall, the message too is that increasingly people are moving less and less. And so even when we hear stories of people moving for tax reasons, these represent a very small number of cases in the context of what we know to be a broader trend. So looking at North Carolina's job growth, we also see a not so unique picture in our state since tax cuts. What you see here is in the dark blue is the line of employment growth rates over the period from pre-Great Recession through to January 2020. You see the dip in job losses from the Great Recession and the recovery. And what you see here is that our numbers really aren't outpacing those of our neighbors to the south and to the west or the north. We're really in the middle of the pack, and that really gives us good, strong evidence that tax cuts haven't generated a boom in jobs. And that makes sense. Oftentimes, these tax cuts amount to less than it would take to hire on a new person. And many of the benefits of the tax cuts, particularly the corporate income tax cuts, are going outside of the state to shareholders, not to locally owned businesses. At the same time, because we don't have the revenue coming in, we're not able to invest in the kind of small businesses, locally owned businesses that need small business assistance and other supports to bring their ideas to market. So the last piece I think that's incredibly important to talk about is how the tax code and tax choices of the past decade are impacting North Carolinians. And when we look at the total share of tax cuts each year and how they're divided out across income groups, we find that the richest 20% receive 67% of the total tax cuts that are delivered through the changes that have been made in North Carolina. At the same time, those who benefit are disproportionately white taxpayers. So what you see here is in the left-hand column, the share of taxpayers by race and ethnicity. And then you see the share of the tax reduction received by that racial or ethnic group. And you see quite clearly that for white taxpayers, the share of the tax reduction is greater. And this is really because we know the history of wealth and income in our country and in our state continues to benefit white households and presents barriers for Black households and households of color. I want to just say one thing about the broader context as well. As I've talked about the outside organizations that have consistently lobbied and worked to make sure that legislators are advancing this tax agenda. I talked about what these policies have actually led to in terms of impact, but I think there's also some other drivers at work in the tax decisions that have gotten made over the past decade. So one is that that state and local tax decisions are often driven by recessions and recoveries. And North Carolina's experience of more frequent and deeper recessions, both in the early 2000s and the Great Recession, and then the impact of the pandemic, are significant reasons for legislators to visit and revisit tax changes on a regular basis. The second thing I think it's important to note, and this is a little bit unique to the pandemic recovery, which is that federal funding, both in the Great Recession, but even more so in the pandemic recovery, provided an incredible stabilizing force for state and local government budgets. And those federal dollars meant different tax decisions were possible at the state and local level that would have had a more significant impact on day-to-day services and communities. And then I think finally another motivating factor is that a lot of local governments are increasingly looking to become more responsive to the trends and needs in their community. And decisions at the local level around property tax in North Carolina are often motivated by conversations, not just about what the gaps are in funding that they're getting, local governments are getting from federal and state, but also in terms of who pays at the local level. So you see a lot of work happening around property tax relief programs and policies. I think one other contextual piece that I would be remiss if I didn't name in a presentation about our current tax code is that tax policymaking is increasingly anti-democratic. And I mean that in the sense of without public input and transparency. Two particular shifts that have happened in the past decade that have impacted how tax decisions play out. One is the state constitution now has a cap on income taxes that is lower than where it was pre these changes in 2013, and really locks in the changes that were made over this past decade. That happened in 2018. The second change that really has impacted the process for people impacting tax decisions is that many rate reductions don't happen in the same year that they are voted on. They get scheduled for many years out. So for example, in 2023, rate reductions were scheduled out through 2027. Those changes in statute are very hard to impact as a voter, as someone who wants to engage, and very hard to change as they've already been put in law. So what the effect of this is that while the state has a balanced budget requirement, each year the state has to use the revenue it has to fund the public services it needs. It is constrained at the outset by the revenue choices that were made years before. And people are increasingly being told, we can't make a change right now. We don't have the money, or we can't fund that. And it's because tax choices were made and built in this anti-democratic way. So the result is this picture, which just shows you how low spending has remained as a share of the economy. So this is total state spending as a share of the state's economy since 1970. And I think I would point you to the, I think if I use my arrow here, I can show you the post-recession, Great Recession decline that has continued to impact the state spending. As our economy continues to grow, we're spending less to provide that foundation of services and goods to keep people connected to opportunity and wellness. Looking forward from where we are now, we know that the scheduled rate reductions will mean a loss of over $13 billion in revenue by 2031. That's 40% of the state budget today. That is more than the entire state budget for public schools, the 2,400 public schools in our state that serve 1.4 million children. 13 billion is roughly equivalent it's actually more than what we spend on our K-12 system. So I think I want to talk briefly about how tax policies are evaluated. I talked a little bit about the drivers. I talked about the impacts. I talked about the arguments for and the evidence against. But really, the arguments for and the evidence against should be something that we evaluate at the very beginning of a process. And what I'm here to say is that it's very much a black box how tax policies get evaluated in North Carolina. We don't have a really good understanding from the public or even from folks who follow tax policy making in a lot of detail what criteria are being used to evaluate the tax decisions that are being proposed and put forward. We hear sometimes public debate, but not often in committee rooms. We see the Fiscal Research Division produce fiscal notes with 5-year projections oftentimes of only the revenue impacts. So Fiscal Research produces these to show how much a tax decision will impact the state and local revenue raising capacity. But there is no official analysis provided of how tax decisions will impact people by income group, by racial or ethnic group, or by geography. And this is a real challenge if we want to see our decisions really planned for and understood at the front end. Deeper analysis and evaluation of these policy options needs to happen. 3 criteria that we use in thinking about tax policy that I would argue should be part of the conversation about any tax proposal that gets put forward is answering the question, who pays? When we make this change, who will pay? How much more will they pay? How much less will they pay? We also have to ask, can this tax change allow us to continue to pay for public goods and services today? Will it allow us to pay for goods and services into the future? Is it going to grow with the growing costs of delivering public goods? And then I think the last criteria is, will it reinforce income inequality and racial inequities in our economy? These are critically important issues that not only disrupt the ability of people to reach their full potential, but it impacts more than just jobs and housing and community life. It impacts our democracy. We know that inequality and racial inequities have a profound impact on the cohesion in our communities. So I think today where we sit is that North Carolina's tax code is governed by the idea of a flat, low income tax rate that is headed to 0. That means over time, a likely increased reliance on sales tax, local property tax, and fees, and is increasingly inadequate, already inadequate, to fund the future of a growing state. I'm happy to take questions and open up the floor, but thank you so much for allowing me to share some of our analysis of our current tax code.
Thank you, Alexandra. As I said, we have a handful of questions from the committee. I think, Lucille, you're still not able technically to join us. I'll pose the questions then. Sorry about that. We just had some technical issues. You have mentioned in your presentation in a couple of places about local taxes and property taxes. And as you know, our tax policy position includes both state and local. So one of the questions we have is, how are local property taxes controlled by the state legislatures as opposed to at the local level? And if you could talk a little bit, I think I know some of us may know the answer to this question, but you could talk a little bit to us what local taxes primarily fund at the local level as well.
Right. So local property tax is governed by state law in terms of the ability to pursue different relief options in particular. And what is subject to taxation under the property tax is also governed by state law. But local counties have the option to have the opportunity and the authority to raise property tax rates. They will often do that in response to growing needs, to shifting property tax bases. But there are real limits on what options are available in terms of the design of property tax specifics, the base, and who pays, that are left to the state. So oftentimes where policymakers at the local level are pursuing local property tax issues like exemptions for older North Carolinians, they're actively engaging with state legislators to move those ideas forward. The question about where local taxes go is a little bit more complicated, and I just say by a preface, local taxes, local taxing authority is very limited in North Carolina. North Carolina's local governments really only have the option to raise property taxes, to collect sales tax revenue, and then to collect fines and fees. There is no provision to provide local governments with the option of raising income taxes, local income taxes. That is the case in other states across the country, but not here in North Carolina. The reason why I couldn't give you an exact answer to where local dollars go as opposed to other dollars is that they all sort of come together in a pot and then go back out. But oftentimes when you hear local leaders talk about why local dollars need to be raised, it's to fill in the gaps that are there because state dollars are no longer flowing for certain priorities. So in the past decade, we've seen local governments talk about the need to fund public school building, remediation, building, because the state is no longer providing the same level of funding for those capital needs. We've heard of teacher supplements and funding for various school personnel as a necessary funding priority that local governments have used their own source revenue to supplement. Oftentimes, too, local dollars are needed to match or draw down federal or state dollars. And so really, I think it's great that you're looking at both state and local, because they are very much a piece of people's experience here in North Carolina. If we don't look at both of those tax policies and we don't think about what the ultimate impact is on the individual person, we won't have a complete picture of tax policy in North Carolina.
Thank you. And maybe if I dare us trying to highlight some bright spots with this question, do you know, or can you cite any specific provisions in our state or local tax codes that actually incent positive behaviors? And I think typically I personally think of tax credits or tax exemptions, that also those kinds of things may be consistent with the league's policy positions on things like public education. You actually talked about that a lot when we talked about local taxes, or natural resources, or child and elder care, or land use planning. Either something that's happened, since 2013 that either increase those kinds of things or put them in the tax code. I know you did mention about the increase in standard deduction, but I didn't know whether there was anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good reminder to look at what what has happened in a holistic way. I mentioned the capping of itemized deductions. Itemizing deductions is something that very few people in North Carolina do. It's generally something that someone with a lot of income adopts as their way of filing income taxes. And so by capping it, legislators were creating more sort of reliability in terms of the estimates of how much those deductions would end up taking out of public funds. So that's a positive in the sense of really trying to get a better handle on it. And it had a more equitable impact on the distribution of tax cuts. I think the other piece that has been thought about is another tax kind of policy on the business side, or on the sort of real estate side, is the historic preservation tax credit. Looking at the ways in which we can encourage the redevelopment of existing buildings, historic buildings, and both homes and commercial spaces has been a significant boost, particularly in rural places, particularly in downtowns across the state. And that program has been continued and enhanced over time.
Lucille has a question. She's wondering if there's any new taxes that are being considered that haven't yet surfaced in the public realm that are you aware of?
Well, I think an important one to talk about would be around sports gambling. So those actually have been in the public realm in the sense that there was a significant debate last year around sports gambling and the way to tax both the operators and the licensed operators and companies. The impact of that is likely to not generate the revenue that is being promised, but that is a tax that people who engage in sports gambling will both pay on earning or winnings, and then also, the companies will pay. So that's a new tax that will roll out in the next year. There's not a lot of conversation about raising revenue. And I think it's one of the biggest ways in the last year that legislators talked about raising revenue was not adopting some of the federal tax policies that were coming down. So in the past few years, there was a significant effort to forgive student loans for borrowers who had student loans still. And those dollars in North Carolina are taxed. So that was a choice that the legislators made to keep a tax on that. They could have exempted it and followed some other states and federal opportunities that were opened up. And so that's a new tax in the sense of not taking up that option.
Right.
I don't know if that's helpful.
Question from a member of the audience. How would a baby bond be funded, and would it apply to all babies or by parental income?
This is a great question. I'm excited that somebody asked this, because this is one of the opportunities I think North Carolina has, which is around learning from the federal expansion of the child tax credit. And many of you probably followed this. The federal expansion made that child tax credit fully refundable, and delivered monthly checks to households. And by all accounts, across the country, it reduced poverty by almost half, had a significant impact on the well-being of families. And North Carolina could fund this if we stopped the corporate income tax elimination. And so I think to the design question of a baby bonds policy, it's not exactly a baby bonds policy, but I think we have models for how we can use tax policy to deliver benefits to families and supports for the healthy development and opportunity of every child in the state. Funding it is very possible in a modest way at the state level. I'll be honest, the proposals that I've looked at for universal baby bonds often will require a federal commitment because of the level at which they would like to see an investment that is significant enough to really catapult someone into a better trajectory going forward in adulthood. But happy to share more resources on that.
Oh, great, thank you. I have one last question, and where do you think the league could influence state and local tax policies? And I think I asked that, or we asked this question because, as you know, we're not, as citizens of the state, not able to do any sort of citizen initiative referendum. We're, with the gerrymandering we've got a majority, if not a super majority, in terms of the controlling party. So particularly because your organization does advocacy, what are you seeing as being effective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that digging deep into the topic like you all are doing is a start, and sharing that information broadly is the next step. One of the biggest challenges we have on tax policy is that people glaze over and don't necessarily see tax policy as their kids' public school or their parents' adult day center, or the ability to go to the ballot box and have election workers there to process their vote. Those sorts of really tangible things in our communities are because we collect taxes. And if we don't do that, we have less and less of that. So the work that you all could be doing to advocate for a shift in people's mindset and a shift in people's hearts around tax policy, I think is what we have to be doing right now. I think in terms of concrete policy proposals, we know that there is a growing concern about the corporate income tax elimination. We know that there's also a growing interest from families in seeing something like a child tax credit available in North Carolina. And so I think these are not partisan issues. These can be bipartisan, and we can move them in really important ways. As I showed, most people agree with these ideas. And so I think it is about connecting with legislators, inserting it into every policy conversation that happens, inserting it into candidate forums and conversations with those who would seek to run for office. All of that is really important to sort of making this an issue that folks have to talk about in a way that's concrete and clear and visionary for what's possible.
Have you seen, just to follow up to that, have you seen any, you touched on it a bit in terms of the Chamber of Commerce, seen any movement anywhere within the business sector where we could also possibly connect with on some of these proposals, so we can maybe together bring some pressure on our legislators?
I think the intersection between childcare and tax policy is really emerging in the employer community and the business community. And I think they'll work with local chambers to really have that conversation about the childcare needs. Folks are struggling right now to find a place for their kids to be so that they can go to work. And that's going to increasingly happen as federal funding goes away this year.
Right.
So I think that's the opportunity in the next years to have those conversations with business groups. I also think that there is a lot of opportunity in thinking about reaching particularly into rural communities that have not seen any benefit from a tax cut agenda. And almost across the board, we know that rural communities consistently are not getting the job growth that is happening in metropolitan areas. And when we don't have the dollars to fund connections to that, either through transportation or better housing, there's really going to be an increasingly disconnect. There already is, that I think it's incredibly important to be working with rural community leaders to talk about what does it look like to actually fund the things that your community needs to thrive. And to me, that requires the tax policy agenda. And it's both important. I think the last thing I'll say about where you could advocate, it's important to engage at the local level, but in reality, the state policy decisions are going to always have the greatest power to deliver equity and equality of opportunity, because rural communities may not have the wealth locally to fully do everything that needs to be done to create a thriving community. But that's why we live in a state. That's why we organized as a state. That's why we're in community together, ideally, is that we should be sharing and figuring out a way to share our resources collectively. And we do that through taxes. So
I know we have, I think we got another question. Do you know of our state, our money pub, now gone but not forgotten, could BTC finance a return of this pub?
Oh, our state. Yeah, I've heard of that. Our state, our money publication, now gone but not forgotten. Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually have a version of that publication that we published last year that I'm happy to share around. It's a little bit higher level than that old publication, but that was a great doc, and we were excited to work on it. But this document provided an overview of the state budget process and budget and tax topics. If it's the same thing I'm thinking about, Kenneth, but I'm happy to share our latest iteration. It's a more condensed version, and it's called Our Dollars, Our Democracy.
And I know we had another question from one of our attendees, and she did as a raise a hand, but I can't, if you could type her question in the Q&A, then I could pose it to you.
Okay.
Or anybody else for that matter. Got a couple of more minutes we could take on questions. Not seeing any. So Elaine, could we throw up our last slide, please? Oh, somebody just might have done something. Oh, the person's question was answered in part, so so that's good. Okay. Wait, well, great. Thank you very much, Elaine. As Elaine said at the beginning, there is a recording of tonight's session, and it will be posted to the LWVNC website. Also, the slides that we used, as well as what Alexandra used as well. And to get to that in the website, you go under the ACT drop-down menu, and then you click on lead action teams, and then you click on state and local tax policy. We've also in that same location posted in the LWVNC website, we posted a document which provides you with the basic terminology and associated definitions. And these terms or terminology are probably going to be used throughout this series. So if you just want to get, yourself better acquainted with basic terminology, it would be a great document to go to. And I thank Ruth Ann for developing that document for us. And lastly, our next session will be held on Tuesday, February 20th at 7 p.m. again. And again, we'll do it Zoom. And this will feature Dr. Ken Clace, retired associate professor with UNC Greensboro. For those of you who may have attended our last state convention, Ken presented with me. And he's going to take a deeper dive into the basic types of state and local taxes and the criteria for a fair and equitable tax system. But further details and registration as well will come from the committee at a later date. So at this, I want to thank Alexandra again and everybody who attended tonight's session, and have a good evening.